Kurt Cobain, the skinny musician from the rain-soaked town of Aberdeen, turned the screams of the lost into the fire of an entire generation. From "Smells Like Teen Spirit" echoing across the world to that exhausted gaze behind the curtain, he was both the symbol of grunge and a man who carried sorrow like an instinct he could never take off. This story begins with childhood fractures, runs through a love that burned fast and broke hard, races across blazing stages, and ends in the quiet rooms where he tried to hide his own collapse. What really killed a man the world believed had already been saved by music. When the electrician happened to look up at the fogged greenhouse window and saw Kurt lying still inside, the world didn't just lose a star. It lost the answer to the greatest paradox of his life. Next to the shotgun and the suicide note, what haunted people most was the half-finished bottle of root beer and the two guitars beside him. It looked like he had been in the middle of an ordinary moment, not the final seconds of a brief 27-year life. To understand that choking moment, the half-finished bottle of root beer lying beside the body of a legend, we have no choice but to go back, all the way to the beginning of a life built on cracks. Because every tragedy has a root, and every light carries a shadow behind it. Kurt Donald Cobain was born on February 20th, 1967, in the damp town of Aberdeen, Washington, a place where rain lingers long enough to wear down even the most stubborn dreams. As a child, Kurt was clever, sharp, and artistically gifted to the point where adults around him often said, "That boy was born to do something different." Around 7, Kurt was diagnosed with ADHD. Doctors gave him Ritalin to keep him focused, then added sleeping pills to counter the insomnia it caused. Those early pills, unintentionally, opened a dangerous door. Kurt learned that emotions could be adjusted chemically. A dark lesson he would repeat years later when drugs finally found their way into his life. At 9, his parents divorced. For many, it was paperwork. For Kurt, it was an earthquake that split the core of his own identity. From a lively, energetic boy, he became quiet, withdrawn. His father remarried. His mother slipped into violent, unstable relationships. Kurt was shuttled between two homes, but didn't truly belong to either. He saw relatives drunk, he saw violence, he saw two uncles take their own lives. Mental wounds that festered silently, unseen by anyone. By 15, he drifted through 10 different homes, sleeping on friends' couches, sometimes under bridges. Weed in middle school, LSD as he got older, then heroin for the first time around 1990. He once said, "Drugs are a painkiller." No one knew whether he meant the pain in his stomach or something much deeper. From those wandering days, from those chords stuck in his throat, the seed of Nirvana was planted. A kind of music with no polish, no decoration, just the raw scream of a soul that had never fully healed. Music became his only life raft, not because Kurt dreamed of fame, but because it was the one place he felt heard, the one place he could exist without being pushed aside. A Melvin show nearly changed the direction of his life. He started with drums, then moved to guitar, the only voice that never betrayed him. On cold nights, Kurt wrote in his journals, drew with markers, pencils, sometimes even blood. An artist was taking shape in absolute solitude. In 1981, at 14, Kurt received the first guitar of his life. A small gift, but one that became the key to the only door he could walk through without being turned away. From that moment on, those cramped Aberdeen rooms echoed with the rough scrape of guitar strings, as if Kurt were learning to translate his pain into a language no one could take from him. Over the years that followed, he drifted through several small-town bands, staying for weeks, sometimes months, but everywhere he went, he changed the atmosphere. not intentionally, but with a kind of intensity and dissatisfaction born straight from his fractured childhood. For a teenager who was both rebellious and abandoned, music was the one place that never kicked him out. By the mid-1980s, Kurt had formed his first project that truly bore his own imprint, Fecal Matter. The raw demos he recorded with Dale Crover made their way to Olympia, and it was that strange, unmistakable sound that caught Krist Novoselic's attention. A quiet connection began, a thread that would lead to something far bigger than those makeshift garage rehearsals. From those rough practices in empty rooms, two young men carrying different forms of loneliness suddenly found a strange resonance with each other. They had no money, no resources, no grand dreams, only the chaotic beats inside their chests and the need to turn them into sound just to keep breathing. That was when Nirvana was conceived, not out of ambition, but out of survival. In 1987, they officially chose a name for the band: Nirvana. A gentle irony, because the two most tormented kids in town had chosen a name that meant absolute liberation. But like most of Kurt's choices, the name was a metaphor. He craved a peace he could never reach. The band went through a revolving door of drummers, from Aaron Burkhard to Chad Channing, each bringing a different color before moving on, as if Nirvana were trying out different heartbeats before finding the right one. Despite the shifting lineup, the core remained Kurt and Krist, one leading with melody, the other with the rare stability in Kurt's chaotic world. In the early years, Nirvana lived in pure hardship, crashing on friends' floors, borrowing rehearsal rooms, playing bars, with a few dozen people being paid in beer or gas money. But amid that instability, they shaped a sound that was unmistakably theirs. Kurt's power chords that seemed simple, but swelled like a wave, his raspy, fragile vocals that listeners heard as confessions, and a raw sincerity no other band at the time possessed. When Sub Pop took notice, they weren't the most promising faces. They were simply the band that made you feel something was exploding inside. In 1988, they recorded their first demos for the indie label, rough, dusty, yet pulsing with a kind of energy the underground scene immediately recognized. This wasn't music meant to sound pretty. It was music meant to wake you up. Those struggling years eventually led Nirvana to their first milestone, Bleach, 1989, released under Sub Pop. No one believed it would change history. It was recorded in under 30 hours with a budget of just $600, most of it borrowed and patched together from odd jobs. Kurt wrote nearly the entire album under constant strain, broke, directionless, and desperate to pour out his turmoil without knowing if anyone cared. Bleach sounded heavy, rough, dark, as if Kurt were scraping open old wounds and throwing them onto tape. Sub Pop loved it. The underground loved it. The album sold over 40,000 copies. Modest for the industry, but for Nirvana, it was the first time anyone outside Aberdeen looked at them and said, "I hear you." Bleach didn't predict the coming earthquake, but it did something more important. It convinced Kurt that the music, his life raft, had become a real path. From Bleach onward, Nirvana's steps grew heavier, more certain, moving toward a light Kurt himself didn't know was glory or a pit, only that it was close. In 1990, Dave Grohl joined as the new drummer. Dave's crisp, thunderous drumming gave structure to Kurt's chaos. That's when the Nirvana sound, explosive yet precise, simple yet detonating, truly took shape. Around this time, Kurt began suffering from chronic stomach pain no doctor could explain, along with nameless bouts of depression, and soon heroin entered his life, first as a way to calm the pain, then as the raft he clung to when he felt himself sinking. By late 1991, Something none of them, not even Kurt, could foresee, happened. Smells Like Teen Spirit began spreading in a way rock songs rarely did. It needed no glossy ads, no giant marketing plan. One radio spin, one MTV airing, and it ignited like an uncontrollable fire. MTV played it so often it became the background rhythm of early 90s youth. In schools, dorm rooms, and damp garages where amateur bands were learning their first chords. Everywhere, people recognized that opening guitar riff as a secret signal of their generation. Within weeks, Smells Like Teen Spirit stopped being a song. It became a declaration. The kids left behind, the teens fed up with polished worlds, even those who didn't know what they were searching for, all clung to Kurt's shredded scream as if it were the only way to breathe. The song shot up Billboard, and Nevermind overtook Michael Jackson, an overturn no one believed a grunge band from Seattle could pull off. Suddenly, the world's eyes locked on Kurt Cobain, but for him, that explosion felt like a blast, happening too close, dazzling, overwhelming, and painful. The moment Teen Spirit became global, Kurt no longer belonged to the small world he had always tried to return to. He became the voice of a generation, even though he never wanted the role. When Teen Spirit pushed Nirvana onto pop culture's peak, the first thing that arrived wasn't glory. It was scrutiny. Overnight, Kurt transformed from an unknown kid to a target of endless questions, cameras, and interviews. Reporters swarmed him, trying to extract the secrets of a generation icon, while Kurt was desperately trying to protect the one thing he had left, the fragile privacy of someone never comfortable under bright lights. The attention drained him. For many, interviews are an honor. For Kurt, they were an intrusion. He didn't know how to answer correctly, didn't know how to play the grunge hero people wanted, and didn't know how to escape the stories being spun around him. Fame, the dream of so many artists, felt like a glass cage to Kurt. Transparent, beautiful, suffocating. Inside Nirvana, cracks began forming. As Nevermind grew too big, questions about songwriting credits and profit splits hovered over them. Not because they didn't respect each other, but because sudden fame made everything complicated. Kurt, who wrote most of the material, hated the feeling of dividing the value of his pain. But he was forced to face legal matters, contracts, negotiations, and piece by piece, tension seeped into his relationships with the others. The same people with whom he once needed only 2 guitars and a garage to feel the world open up. Worse, Kurt's body began waving distress signals. The chronic stomach agony that had tormented him for years remained unsolved. The panic attacks and depression worsened under fame's pressure. He found no rescue in doctors or prescriptions. And so heroin returned, at first a way to calm the storm, later the only quiet place he knew to run to. Kurt never saw himself as an addict in the moral sense. To him, heroin was a temporary stillness, a pause, when his heart raced too fast and the world felt too large. But those pauses stretched longer, deeper, until they became the only refuge he knew. At the exact moment his fame burned brightest, his darkness ran deepest, and between those two extremes, he wavered like someone walking a tightrope, unsure how much longer he could stay balanced. Still, 1991 marked an unerasable milestone. Nevermind landed on Best of the Year lists everywhere. MTV, Rolling Stone, the entire world, all crowned Kurt Cobain the new icon, an icon he never asked to be. As the world began looking at Kurt as the savior of a lost generation, he still saw himself as a thin, exhausted man trying to stay balanced inside a storm that his own success had created. But no matter how overwhelmed he felt, the wheel of fame kept rolling forward, dragging Nirvana into a momentum that could no longer be stopped. In early 1992, Nirvana appeared on MTV, where the stage lights shone on them as if testing whether this phenomenon truly belonged. The explosion of Smells Like Teen Spirit soon carried them to the MTV Video Music Awards, where Nirvana won Best New Artist, and the song collected awards across both the US and the UK. Many saw it as a kind of anointing ceremony for a new band. Yet for Kurt, it was the moment he felt farthest from where he began. Endless tours, interviews, and scrutiny pressed on him with a force he had never known. But Kurt buried himself in music, as if it were the only thing keeping him from breaking apart. By September 1993, Nirvana released In Utero, an album Kurt wanted to be raw, abrasive, and difficult, exactly how he felt about the world at the time. The label wanted it more accessible. Kurt refused. In Utero was a violent jolt, a declaration that Nirvana was never meant to be a product of media polish. Critics understood that instantly. They praised the album as a dark, beautiful act of rebellion, harsh, unfiltered, painfully honest. But perhaps the most emotionally potent moment came right after that. In November 1993, inside the small, dim space of MTV Unplugged in New York, Nirvana left the noise behind. Unlike other Unplugged acts, they rejected anything glamorous. Kurt didn't want the usual hits, didn't want celebrity guests, and didn't even want MTV's standard stage design. He specifically requested candles, white lilies, the kind used at funerals, and an atmosphere that felt like a memorial service. A memorial for whom? For music? For himself? No one knew. But one look at Kurt's eyes that night, distant, heavy, carrying something unsaid, was enough to understand this was not a normal performance. On stage, Kurt's voice didn't scream. It was smaller, more fractured, as if held together by the last bit of breath he had left. When he sang About a Girl, the entire room froze. When he choked through Where Did You Sleep Last Night, several crew members later said they were afraid to breathe. And when the final note ended, even before the cameras fully shut down, Kurt refused any encore. He simply bowed slightly, like someone who had just laid down a truth too heavy to carry any further. That performance, quiet, unadorned, stripped raw, became the artistic pinnacle of Kurt Cobain. Not because of technique, but because it revealed what no studio album could ever capture: the exhaustion of a soul running on empty, and the fragile beauty of a man still singing, even as the pain pressed hard against his ribs. From cramped stages in Aberdeen to becoming the reluctant leader of the grunge movement, Nirvana had climbed a hill no one expected them to reach. But the higher they rose, the clearer and more dangerous the divide between the stage lights and Kurt's private darkness became. Even as every stage blazed under Nirvana's feet, the further they traveled, the further Kurt felt from his true self. Success had come too fast, too violently, like an explosion shaking loose the fragments of childhood he never had time to mend. Tour after tour, interview after interview, new posters stacked on top of old fractures, but covered nothing. In the middle of crowds screaming his name, Kurt heard only the vast, chilling emptiness inside. At the very moment fame was crashing over him like waves, when his health, pressure, and addiction were tightening around him in the quietest, most suffocating ways, Kurt's life suddenly opened in another direction. Not under the bright lights where he was expected to perform, but backstage, where a person could stand without having to act. There, in the noise and exhaustion of music and the growing void of loneliness, Kurt met Courtney Love, an arrival that felt both like a storm and the last life raft drifting toward him as he was sinking. Their meeting didn't just turn a page, it launched him onto an entirely new trajectory. brighter, wilder, and more tragic than anything that came before. In the end, what held Kurt to life was not fame or the roar of crowds, but the longing for a home, a place to put his exhaustion down. And when Kurt believed he had found that place, the next chapter began. A chapter of love, marriage, chaos, and a kind of hope that only survived because he fought for it desperately. Kurt and Courtney loved each other as if they had nothing left to lose. From the very beginning, heroin was already there like a third presence. Not because one led the other into it, but because both had arrived with the habit, using it as a misguided form of self-healing long before they met. Together, they became two people searching for peace inside a needle, instead of in each other. At night, they held each other, recorded tapes, wrote music, believing that chaos was the natural rhythm of a shared life. By morning, addiction pulled them apart, left them drained, irritable, only to cling back to each other again in another attempt to escape. It was a circle with no exit. In 1992, the Vanity Fair interview detonated like a bomb. It implied Courtney had used drugs while pregnant, and whether that was true or not, the media lunged at them like predators. Child Protective Services temporarily removed baby Frances from their custody. For Kurt, a man who had feared abandonment all his life, the scene was like watching his own childhood replay itself. He withdrew, grew suspicious of the media, acquaintances, even himself. Their little house quickly became a storehouse of pressure instead of love. And amid all that chaos, Courtney wasn't just the storm many later painted her to be. There were nights she fought to keep Kurt alive, nights she injected naloxone to pull him back from overdoses in 1993. They went through court hearings, therapy, interventions, medical battles, legal fights, but the harder they tried to hold everything together, the faster it slipped through their hands. Kurt needed peace. Courtney needed combustion. The two needs pulled them in opposite directions. Rumors spread about Courtney and Billy Corgan. The frightening part wasn't the rumor itself, but how directly it struck Kurt's deepest wound, the fear of being replaced. Jealousy wasn't his nature. It was the reflex of a heart abandoned too many times. And yet, amid the turmoil, there were moments almost unbearably tender. Kurt holding Frances, Bean, pressing his cheek against her baby's soft hair. His mouth smiled, but his eyes drifted somewhere far away, as if he were trying to memorize her face before he disappeared from her life. As fractures in the marriage multiplied, as Frances's cries overlapped with his stomach pain, as interventions overlapped with arguments, as love and suspicion coexisted in a home too small to contain both, Kurt entered the period people would later summarize with two simple words: the downfall. But for him, it wasn't a collapse. It was erosion, slow, daily, inevitable. Because even as he tried to hold his family close, heroin continued holding him closer. By late 1993, the world watched Kurt spiral through overdoses. Not once, but multiple times. Until Courtney sometimes had to use naloxone to wrench him back into consciousness. Those moments were like miniature versions of their entire life together. Every time things seemed steady, another wave crashed. In 1994, the biggest warning sign appeared. In a hotel room in Rome, Kurt took Rohypnol with alcohol and fell into a coma. Courtney thought he was gone. The whole world thought he was gone. And Kurt himself later admitted it had been closer to the end than he ever imagined. But when he woke up, he did what he always did. He carried on, as if life had once again chosen to keep him only temporarily. No one in his family or circle of friends dared wait for another sign. On March 25th, an intervention took place at the Seattle home. Krist, Novoselic, Friends, Nirvana's crew. Everyone tried to convince him to step away from the spiral. Kurt almost reluctantly agreed, as if he knew he needed to go but wasn't sure he could survive being away from heroin long enough to get better. On March 30th, Kurt checked into the Exodus Recovery Center in Los Angeles, beginning a detox program everyone hoped would save him from the self-destruction he had been trapped in for months. But the truth was this: Kurt didn't know how to live without the chemical quiet that soothed his mind every night. And the fear of living sober was sometimes greater than the fear of dying. Just one day later, on April 1st, Kurt quietly climbed a wall and slipped out of rehab. No one stopped him. The exit door was only a few steps away, yet he chose the wall, as if he didn't want anyone to see him leaving. He went straight to the airport, used his credit card, and flew back to Seattle. On that flight, fate placed him next to Duff McKagan from Guns N' Roses, who later said he could sense something in Kurt: exhaustion, distance, and emptiness. What chills people when they look back is this. Before entering rehab on March 30th, Kurt and his close friend Dylan Carlson had purchased a Remington Model 11 shotgun. Because Kurt had recently had his guns confiscated after a domestic dispute on March 18th, the shotgun had to be registered under Dylan's name. He also bought ammunition and asked a driver to take it home. When placed on the timeline, many see this as the first marker of a decision forming long before Kurt tried to enter treatment. For months, Kurt had been caught in a war he didn't know which side to fight for: the desire to live for his daughter and the pull toward darkness to escape pain. Every time he tried to heal, his body betrayed him. Every time he tried to quit heroin, the fear of living without it won. And so life and death intertwined, clashing not as two choices, but as two parallel tracks he was forced to walk at the same time. What most people didn't understand was that when someone is used to staring into the abyss, they can look frighteningly normal even while falling. After escaping rehab, Kurt entered a series of days that would later have to be reconstructed piece by piece, from stray receipts, scattered sightings, and fragments of stories, like piecing together shards of a mirror about to hit the floor. The first days of April 1994 had no schedule, no clear purpose. Only a man trying to run from something he couldn't name. From the airport back in Seattle, Kurt's steps seemed to automatically lead him to familiar places in his addiction. The long, damp road near the Krist mobile trailer park, where he bought heroin. No one knows how many times he went there in those last days, only that it was where he turned whenever the pain in his body grew too violent for regular medication. From there he drifted to the Marco Polo Motel, room 226, a dark, tucked-away corner room where he had often lain for hours, fading off in silence, potato chips, and heroin. Years later, a YouTuber rented that exact room to feel what Kurt might have felt, and said that just sitting in the same chair Kurt had once used sent a cold shiver down his spine, as if the room still held a residue of someone's darkness. On April 3rd, Kurt was seen standing outside a Carl's Jr. in Capitol Hill. Witnesses described him as disheveled, deteriorated, his eyes vacant, his body moving as if it no longer knew how to hold itself upright. No one knows why he stood there, waiting for someone, or just waiting for the pain to ease. That evening, he appeared at Linda's Tavern, his final confirmed public sighting. He didn't order a drink, didn't smile, didn't speak. He walked straight toward the back, as if searching for someone no one else could see, and disappeared from public record from that moment onward. Kurt's final days were like a film reel missing frames, and after he vanished completely on the night of April 3rd, Seattle moved around him unaware that one of the loudest voices of a generation had just stepped off the stage. It wasn't until 3 days later that the story entered a chapter no one wanted to read, the chapter of investigation, where cold facts replaced the real human being. On the morning of April 8, 1994, electrician Gary Smith arrived at the Cobain home to install lighting. He glanced up through the greenhouse's fogged window and saw a body lying still inside. What struck him wasn't any gruesome detail, but the unnatural quiet, heavier than the locked room itself. When Seattle police arrived, they found Kurt lying on his back, the Remington Model 11 across his chest. Beside him, a syringe, heroin paraphernalia, a box of shells, and a handwritten note. No signs of struggle, no disturbed furniture. The greenhouse had only one entry point, still locked from the inside, documented in the crime scene report. The medical examiner estimated Kurt had been dead since April 5th, meaning he had lain there for 3 days before being found. The cool Seattle temperatures and sealed environment slowed decomposition, one reason toxicology numbers later became the center of endless debate. Toxicology showed 1.52 millimoles L of morphine in his blood, high enough to render many people unconscious, but not conclusive enough to determine absolute incapacity. Experts noted the sample had been taken from the heart, not peripheral blood, and that post-mortem redistribution over 3 days could elevate concentrations. This made the numbers controversial, but not strong enough to alter the official ruling. The shotgun matched the one purchased with Dylan Carlson on March 30th. Because Kurt's weapons had been confiscated, the Remington was legally registered under Dylan's name. The receipts for the gun and shells matched the items at the scene. And then there was the note, the paper that became the nucleus of every conspiracy. It was addressed to Bauda, Kurt's childhood imaginary friend. The main body of the note was a confession of spiritual exhaustion. Kurt wrote he no longer felt the joy of performing, that the fatigue made him feel dishonest on stage, that success had severed his connection to the music that once saved him. He apologized to fans, to those who believed in Nirvana and expressed love for Courtney and Francis. A love he said was stronger than anything, but not strong enough to outrun the unnamed pain inside him. The controversy lay in the final lines, smaller, slanted handwriting referring directly to leaving this world. Some suspected forgery, saying the style didn't match. Police and handwriting experts responded that stress, drug influence, and Kurt's own history of switching handwriting styles could explain the variation. Previous journals showed he regularly changed size, angle, and intensity based on emotion. Investigators found no sign of a second person, no foreign fingerprints, no shoe prints, no forced entry, no disturbance. The unclear fingerprints on the shotgun were not abnormal. Many firearms have oily, slick surfaces or are wiped down, making prints unreadable. Several undeveloped film rolls were found in Kurt's bag, but none contained suspicious material. The case was reviewed in 2014, 20 years later, with more advanced forensic tools. The ruling remained unchanged. Suicide. Like his career, Kurt's death was never quiet. The inconsistencies, drug levels, handwriting, paraphernalia placement, timeline gaps, were enough to leave the door cracked open for questions. Not because the truth was hidden, but because Kurt's story was born from shadows. Shadows even forensic science can't fully illuminate. In the end, despite the legal conclusion, his death remains an open wound, leaving behind the sense that somewhere between the light and the darkness of his life, Kurt chose to leave in a way that ensured the world would never fully understand him. Perhaps the most haunting part isn't the greenhouse or the gun, the numbers in the toxicology report, or the debates that still haven't stopped. The most haunting part is the silence after he vanished. A strange silence, soft but aching. Like when a guitar string stops vibrating but its echo lingers in the air for a very long time. His death did not close the story. It only forced the world to look back at everything he left behind and realize it was never the legacy of a star, but of a human being who spent his life trying to speak honestly about his pain. Only months later, the world watched Kurt deliver his final performance through MTV Unplugged. No screams, no distorted guitars, just a thin man sitting among candles and white flowers, singing in a voice both trembling and tender. When the album won a Grammy, no one celebrated. People went quiet because everyone knew it was the most beautiful, saddest farewell he ever gave. Nirvana ended after him, but what they stood for spread wider than ever. Artists across genres, from rock to alternative to pop, still cite Kurt as the one who opened the door for them to be honest with themselves. Grunge may have faded, but the spirit Kurt breathed into his generation remains. Unmasked vulnerability, unviolent anger, and loneliness turned into art. Francis Bean, the child he once held with hands trembling from pain, grew up with eyes so much like his that people gasped. She is the softest part of Kurt's legacy. Proof that amid the chaos, he longed to be a good father, even if the fear of abandonment from his own childhood kept pulling him into the dark. And the world, for 3 decades, has continued coming to the benches at Veretta Park, treating it like a shrine. The scribbled lines, "You are missed. Thank you. I hope you found peace," do not only mourn an artist, they speak to a man who poured all his pain into music so that other lonely souls might feel less alone. Looking back at the whole journey, from a boy torn from his home, to the reluctant voice of a generation, to his final days wandering Seattle like a fading shadow, one thing becomes clear. Kurt's tragedy was not a collapse, but a battle he had fought far too long without anyone truly seeing it. A battle between the world's applause and the silence inside him. Between the desire to be loved and the fear of being left. Between the light people gave him and the darkness he hid. And when the greenhouse door finally closed, what remained was not scandal or theory, but the question that still quiets every room whenever his voice is heard again. How is it that the people who make the world feel less lost are often the ones who cannot find a way out for themselves? If this journey through Kurt Cobain's light and shadow leaves you with something to think about, share your thoughts below. I'd love to know which moment stayed with you. And don't forget to like and subscribe so you won't miss the other life stories ahead, where every fate holds a secret worth hearing.